Welcome to the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I'm Laura DiFrancesco, your host. We're talking all about mergers and acquisitions, buying and selling small businesses, as well as corporate law. We are taking our experience closing over $10 billion of transactions since founding Dean Street Law 5 years ago, and my experience being an M&A and corporate attorney for over a decade and making it accessible to you as an entrepreneur. I hope that this helps you in navigating the complex world of mergers and acquisitions. And also, we're always happy to be a resource for you here at Dean Street Law. You can always apply to work with us through our complimentary consultations linked in our show notes. And a huge shout out and thank you to everyone who's subscribed and left us a 5-star review. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe and also leave us a 5-star review. It's one of the best ways to support us as a small business. And also be sure to share with your friends and colleagues on social media, through text, email, or however is easiest. It means the world to us that you're supporting our content and helps us make more to support you in your journey. Welcome back to the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I'm your host, Laura DiFrancesco, founder of Dean Street Law, your mergers and acquisitions boutique law firm for buying and selling lower middle market and middle market businesses. I'm also the author of Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, a legal guide to buying a small business. It's a great book to learn more on the legal aspects of buying a small business if it's something that you're interested in. And in addition, I have multiple businesses of my own. So not only am I coming at this from a legal perspective with 8 years working in big law, 6 years having Dean Street Law with a great team where we've closed over $10 billion of transactions, but also as an owner of businesses, multiple businesses myself, Dean Street Law, Ethereal Farms, Flourish Co-working and Event Space, Laura DiFrancesco LLC, White Horse Investment Group, and a number of others. So I'm really excited to get into today's topic. We're going to be talking about acquiring a government contractor. And this is something that we've seen more and more of. We used to see traditional ETA be focused on blue collar businesses such as electrical and plumbing, HVAC, etc. Now you're seeing much more disparity between the different types of industries that people are interested in. More and more people are buying according to a more blue ocean strategy that considers what moat of competition that there is, what can they do to prevent competition, or what can they do to buy a business that is more insulated from competition. One of those might be that there is a license required for the business. Another one might be that it is contracting with government entities, and those contracts are very hard to acquire. So we're going to be talking about how government contracting specifically influences the acquisition process and the target acquisition company. So how does it influence your process of buying the business, and then how will it influence the process of operating the business once you've been able to buy it? So there's a lot of really important factors when we're talking about government contracting. And there's so many different facets of government contracting. It could be government contracting from a standpoint of somewhere in their economic chain, there is government contracting. They may be supporting government contractors, or company may be a government contractor themselves. So you really have to understand, first off, where does government contracting come into play with respect to this business, and how is it influenced? Is there a risk? Is it a bidding process where for every single project they need to bid it out? Or is it a multi-year contract that renews? Is it subject to funding? We have found with increased geopolitical risk and increased political risk that funding, of course, with many different aspects of recent changes that there have either been slow or they've been reassessed. And most government funding is reassessed at some point. So even with government contracts that last 3+ years, there is often a provision in there, if it's dependent on a government program or something like that, that if funding is not provided, that the contract auto terminates. So first off, you just want to see in the whole sphere of this, what type of government contracting are we talking about? Where is the government contracting in the economic relationship of the business? And is it renewing? Is it bidding every single time, right? Like, what are the details here that we're really talking about? And then you want to understand the risks and the influences. Is it a risk based on the political party that's in office at the time? Is it a risk based on continued funding of the business? So those are a couple of different just macro components that we're thinking about. And then in addition to that, we're really looking at the contracts specifically. The government contracts specifically, what types of provisions do they have regarding termination and funding or transfer of ownership or anything like that. And then also understanding what that process of government contracting is. Is it bidding every single project? Is it coming up for renewal every 3 to 6 years? Something that we can really understand sort of where are the risks associated with the business. And then you might start working with your attorney on how can we mitigate those risks. Can we, depending on the financing that we do, is it an SBA loan where there can be the seller involved post-closing or not? And how can we create a structure of compensation to tie those compensation of the seller post-closing to the mitigation of those risks? So oftentimes with big government contracts, especially where maybe they only have, we've done a deal where there was literally one customer for the entire company. They had multiple contracts with this one customer, which was a government entity, but multiple facets within that government entity. But it was literally just that one customer. And so there was compensation post-closing in the form of a variable seller note. Some people talk about it as a forgivable seller note, tied to the continuation and continuity of that contract revenue continuing, and the continuing contract being one. So then the seller would be incentivized to transfer those relationships and make sure that the buyer is able to be successful post-closing. So you really want to understand what are the regulatory risks and what are the contractual obligations that are specifically unique to this business and the government contracts as well. Oftentimes you will see that there is some sort of termination language, assignment language, and or when they're bidding, they might have to be a certain type of contractor, or they might be benefited if they were a certain type of contractor. So when you're working with government contracts, there are benefits to either being a small disadvantaged business, but there must be certifications around that, whether it's a minority-owned business or a women-owned business. And there's different programs as well, such as the 8A program. So you really want to understand, is the business benefiting from these certain certifications or programs? And if so, are you as the buyer able to continue those? And also, what are the requirements of those certifications and programs? For instance, a women-owned business, it must be certified as a woman-owned business. In addition, it has to not just be ownership, but also control and day-to-day operation of the business must be women-owned. So it's not just like you could say on paper it's women-owned, but it not actually be. And there's audits and everything of that. So when you're thinking about those contracting benefits to certain programs or certifications, you want to think through, as the buyer, are you able to either acquire those certifications or participate in those programs, or are you going to be able to continue on if it's already been something that the business has been benefiting from? If you aren't, that obviously changes the economics of the deals. If the business wasn't participating in these benefit programs, then, and you're able to as the buyer, that can be a benefit. Veteran-owned business, minority-owned business, women-owned business, et cetera, can all help with respect to government contracting, because a certain percentage of government contracts have to go to small disadvantaged business in various aspects of government contracting. In addition, we talked about understanding the contracts and the bidding process. So how are qualifications submitted for the process? In certain government contracts, it requires the owner specifically to have a certain amount of years of experience, and you have to think of whether the owner currently that has those years of experience needs to in some way be an owner or be in the business post-closing to maintain that qualification, and how the business processes invitations to bid, ITBs, and what the bidding process looks like. So there's all different types of qualifications that the government might look for in terms of ownership, experience, certifications the business has, licenses that the business has. Those are all may be a part of the bidding or contracting process. And we want to make sure that there's continuity through all of those throughout the transaction process. And we're considering those both from the legal standpoint, representing you in buying a business, and also to making sure that there won't be any impacts to income or risk post-closing as it relates to that. Obviously, you as the buyer are working on the buy side aspects of these, the business aspects of these. You're probably looking more into funding and everything, and whether there's political risk. But this is a part of our due diligence as well that we think of. When it comes to navigating corporate law, entrepreneurship, and managing small businesses, experience matters. Dean Street Law is a boutique corporate firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions, and additional focus in real estate, commercial transactions, finance, and corporate governance. With over $10 billion in deals closed, Dean Street Law has extensive experience representing hundreds of clients in thousands of transactions, from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. Whether you need startup guidance or advice on closing multi-million or multi-billion-dollar deals, we're your trusted partner every step of the way. Visit deanstreetlaw.com in the show notes to schedule a complimentary consultation. With respect to contracts specifically, there may be some nuances required for the transfer of the business and how those contracts may be acquired. So, under a stock purchase, what you're going to be looking for is change of control provisions. That's what we're going to be looking for, and assignment provisions to see what they say and how the contracts may be assigned. Most of the time, if you're talking about government contracting, it's going to be the sale of the business entity itself via a stock purchase or an equity purchase or a membership interest purchase or a partnership interest purchase. But if it's not a government contractor, you might consider something more like an asset purchase. Asset purchases are very difficult in government contracting businesses because the contracts often have provisions of anti-assignment or change of control provisions. So we would be looking over those. If it's an asset purchase, you assign the contracts as the transfer of ownership of the contracts. If it's a stock purchase, there is no transfer of the contracts themselves because there's just a transfer of the equity ownership interests of the business that hold the contracts. And whether those government consents or notices are required will, of course, impact your timeline. And when you're talking about consents or notices from a government entity, you can inquire as to how long that may take, how long that typically takes, but ultimately that becomes something that's out of your control. So oftentimes we'll put either the LOI or the purchase agreement or specific notes within the expiration or termination clauses that the relationship between the buyer and the seller will continue to automatically renew until such time where it won't even consider to be lapsed or terminate prior to the government contractor or government entity providing consent or something like that to the transaction. So we really want to make sure that the deal doesn't just die just because you're waiting on consent, and otherwise the buyer and the seller are fully aligned. They've both invested tens of thousands of dollars in the transaction. We don't want the deal just to fall apart just because the government's being slow, which it tends to be in many regards. So we want to make sure that your timeline, your termination, your extension provisions, all of those match the type of deal that you're actually working with so that it doesn't come as a surprise and cost everyone tens of thousands of dollars unnecessarily. The next thing is mitigating risk in the purchase agreement. Because it is generally going to be a purchase of the business itself, the business entity, not an asset purchase, we want to make sure that there's strong representations and warranties regarding regulatory compliance and the knowledge of the renewal of contracts or anything like that. Representations and warranties ultimately are is the business that you think you're buying actually the business that you are buying? So we want to make sure to pay special attention to those, as well as indemnification. Indemnification is going to be the assumption of risk or the allocation of risk of liabilities from the buyer to the seller or the seller to the buyer. And so essentially indemnifying someone agrees to make them whole in the event that they are sued or a claim is made against them. And because you're buying the entire entity instead of just buying the assets, there is considerably more risk for pre-closing liabilities. So we want to make sure that we address those. Even still, there can always be successor liability. So whoever says that asset purchases are always better than stock purchases truly don't know what they're talking about. With that said, there are a lot of things that we need to do as your legal counsel to make sure that you are properly protected in the acquisition of any business, but especially the acquisition of government contracting business. There may also be other nuances and wrinkles associated with acquiring a government contractor related to confidentiality, access of information, particularly data sensitivity, data privacy, cybersecurity risk, all of those, especially depending on what level of information that they receive from the government entities and how confidential their information is with respect to their contracting with the government entities. So defense contracts, you're talking about clearance rights with government clearance. You're also talking about very high risk of confidentiality and whatnot. So we want to make sure that all of those are appropriately covered. In certain instances, we want to really bolster indemnification support with practical aspects of how are you going to recover if there's actually an issue, which may require escrows, may require set off and clawback provisions to enable you to recover in the event that there is a requirement to need to tap into those indemnification provisions. As we mentioned, contracts are everything in a government contracting business. Ultimately, every party can always agree to whatever they can agree to legally that's enforceable and conscionable, all these things between a buyer and the seller. But a lot of the constraints of the business and the transfer of the business will come from those government contracts specifically. So getting legal counsel involved very early, pre-LOI, to negotiate the LOI, and then also as soon as, if not that, which I do significantly recommend, especially in a more complex business like this, that you get counsel engaged early. We've done a lot of government contracting, and so we're very familiar with the challenges of it and the nuances of it. So get counsel involved very early, pre-LOI, but if not, immediately as soon as an LOI is signed, and really work quickly and diligently on due diligence to understand the necessary legal structure and what you need to do to get to closing, what consents you need, what post-closing notifications you need, all of that. That will really help you move towards this in the best way possible, because ultimately time is money, and any deal with government contracting will take more time. Expect it to take at least 120 days, purely because there's a lot more risk, there's a lot more nuances, regulations, compliance. We need to make sure that all of those are diligenced, we have proper reps and warranties, good indemnifications, good documentation throughout, and you probably are also going to require some level of notices or consents being sent. So we want to build that all into the process for you so that you know what to expect, the seller knows what to expect, and you can have a successful acquisition of a government contracting entity. So with that said, those are just a few of the first things that we talk about when we're working with clients on this. We've worked on many different deals dealing with government contracting. We are located in the Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland region. So we see a lot of activity with DC, Maryland, Virginia. We have a lot of clients working on government contracting there, but honestly, all across the country. We just did a deal in New York and Arizona, California, to name a few, that also had government contracting involved in it. So if it's something that you'd like to discuss, we'd be happy to discuss it with you. You can schedule a consultation call through our show notes. We would love to speak with you, and happy to share more about how we can support you in acquiring a government contracting business. Please let us know if there's anything else that you'd like us to cover. We would love to hear what else would be helpful. I think we've also done an episode on manufacturing, acquiring a manufacturing business, and acquiring a healthcare business. So if you haven't yet, check those out. We'll also be having some guests. We love to hear who you like to hear on the podcast. And be sure to give us a 5-star review and share with your friends. It's the best way to support the podcast. Thank you, cheers, and happy deal making. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco podcast. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and that it brought you one step closer to mastering the art of mergers and acquisitions. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to follow and subscribe to Dealmaking with Laura DiFrancesco on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. And if you found value in our discussion, please leave a 5-star review. It would mean the world to us. And share this podcast with your network, friends, and colleagues. For more in-depth resources, be sure to visit our website, deanstreetlaw.com, where you can find articles, guides, and more information on our services. Don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest episodes, updates, tips, and exclusive content. You can find us on LinkedIn, Search Funder, at LMDFrancesco on X, and at Dean Street Law on Instagram. Join us on our next episode where we'll explore more deal-making insights. Cheers and happy deal making.